Alright, this is Numbers 27 in the Prager Rational Bible. Let's begin. The 5 daughters. Verse 1, the daughters of Zelophehad of the Maaseiite family, the son of Hepher, the son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, son of Joseph, came forward. The names of the daughters were Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. Given that many students of the Bible would be hard-pressed to identify Zelophehad, it is remarkable that the names of his 5 daughters are recorded 3 times in the Torah. This verse, and then the previous chapter in verse 33, and then also in Numbers 36:11. In fact, 2 of the daughters' names, Noah and Tirzah, are still used as girls' names among the Jews. They are is a testament, as we will soon see, to their high regard in which these early fighters for justice and women's rights continue to be held. And in Hebrew, Noah, N-O-A, is pronounced Noah. And Noah's name is actually pronounced, N-O-A-H. You can spell it either way. But that's pronounced Noach in Hebrew. Alright, so the courage of 5 women and the moral achievement of ancient Israel. Verse 2, they stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the chieftains, and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they said, our father died in the wilderness, and he was not left. He was not one of the Korah's faction which banded together against the Lord, but he died for his own sin, and he has left no sons. So the greatness of Zelophehad's daughters is nowhere more evident than in this verse. These women brought a petition before Moses, Eleazar the high priest, and the chieftains and the whole assembly at the entrance of the tent of meeting, no less. So these were courageous women. But it's also a statement about ancient Israel's regard for women, that 5 women knew that they could approach and petition Israel's leaders and do so in front of the whole community. Otherwise, they probably would have been afraid to do so if they probably weren't being treated very well. And the daughters added these words, that their father died for his own sin. So in describing their father's death, of course, emphasizing he was not killed for the sin of participating in Korach's rebellion. Presumably, they mentioned this to remove any suspicions the leaders might have in adjudicating their case. And if he didn't die in the aftermath of the Korach rebellion, for what sin did Zelophehad die? One possible answer is that he died because he was a member of the generation that died in the wilderness before entering the promised land, for the sins of the golden calf incident, constant complaining, and heeding the disbelieving spies. However, if what the daughters meant was that their father died for the sins of his generation of Israelites, it seems to me that they would have said our father died like all others of his generation, not that he died for his own sin. This is why the only thing of which we can be certain is that the daughters were empathetic that their father did not die for having taken part in the Korach rebellion, and anything else is conjecture. And conjecture is what later Jews did. For example, the Talmudic sage, Rabbi Akiva, however you say that, he assumed that the words he died for his own sin definitely referred to a particular sin. So Akiva conjectured that Zelophehad was the man who publicly violated the Sabbath, the wood gatherer, in Numbers 15:32 through 36, and he was put to death for doing so. But that's most unlikely, as Moses may have well known the identity of that man. And Akiva's view was not universally held, and there was another rabbi, Judah ben, Benera, however you say that. He criticized Akiva for offering that speculation. And whether Akiva was right or wrong, Rabbi Judah argued, identifying Zelophehad was in sin, saying, "If you are wrong, Akiva, you would have slandered an innocent man, and if you are correct, well, who gave you the right to reveal what the Torah has concealed?" I think that's a good point. There's a little footnote, and that's a reference, Babylonian Talmud, Shabbat 96b. Guess where that's found. Alright, got an essay here. Essay, Moral Evolution or Immoral Revolution. Alright, verse 4. Let not our father's name be lost to his clan just because he had no son. Give us a holding among our father's kinsmen. And Moses brought their case before the Lord. And the Lord said to Moses, the plea of Zelophehad's daughters is just, and you should give them a hereditary holding among their father's kinsmen, transfer their father's share to them. So Zelophehad's daughters asked Moses to inherit what would have been inherited by a son if Zelophehad had one. Their primary motivation was not to obtain an inheritance. It was, as this verse makes clear, that their father's name may not be lost to his clan. And as Dennis Olson explains, ancient Israel had a perennial, perennial, however you say that, inheritance system whereby the land was passed from father to son, and so kept within the family and tribe. And this ensured that the land originally apportioned to a given tribe stayed with that tribe. While God's ruling in this case was a real advance towards women's equality, the women themselves make it clear that they have no desire to overthrow the system. There's an important lesson here. Those who wish to improve society need to be clear. Do they wish to improve an already existing and essentially decent society, or do they wish to destroy the whole system? That's the difference between moral evolution and what almost always leads to immoral revolution. And for those who want to improve society, revolution is almost never the way to achieve it. Since ultimately revolution, you're destroying the whole thing to start all over again. You think the whole thing is evil. And modern history attests to this. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Communist Revolution all led to enormous evil. Yep. And the American Revolution led to enormous good, but while called a revolution, it was a revolt. It revolted against British rule, but it did not overthrow Britain values. It improved on them. That is why, as I explained regarding slavery, the Torah did not completely ban slavery. Instead, some 3,000 years ago, it uniquely advanced the human rights of a slave. For example, it legislated the death penalty for anyone who kidnapped a human being in order to sell him. Exodus 21:16, which, by the way, would go against that whole slave trade thing. So there you go. And it prohibited returning a runaway slave to his master. Yeah, which you could do that in the United States, unfortunately. And that's Deuteronomy 23:16. It decreed a master who killed his slave would be put to death. That would be Exodus 21:20. And it decreed a master who causes his slave to lose a limb or even just a tooth is obligated to free the slave. Exodus 21:26 through 27. And in the opening to the Ten Commandments, the moral cornerstone of Western civilization, God described Egypt as a house of slaves. And there's an essay, Why Didn't the Torah Abolish Slavery? And that's in the Exodus Rational Bible at Exodus 21, if you got it. Indeed, according to the Catholic historian Bishop Thomas A. Welch, those who led the way for the nearly universal abolition of slavery were Christians, whose opposition to slavery was rooted in the Bible, especially the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. And here's, I guess, what this Thomas A. Welch had to say. The Christians who were involved in the struggle for liberation of slaves possessed a common body of biblical concepts that made them feel confident that the cause to which that they were committed was endorsed by the will of God. And in 1671, George Fox, who lived from 1624 through 1691, he founded the Quaker movement. He preached to a group of followers a sermon calling for the application of the principles of the Mosaic manumission towards all slaves held by the Quakers. Quoting from Deuteronomy 15:12 through 15, Fox reminded the Quakers of the Mosaic injunction requiring the manumission, however you say that, bondservants after 6 years of service. Now, his sermon was not a rejection of slavery per se. Rather, it was a call for its limitation and for a benevolent sentiment in the administration of the institution. Furthermore, Fox's sermon laid the groundwork for later development of anti-slavery theology in the British Empire. And of course, really the big guy that would help bring an end to slavery in Britain would be this guy, William Wilberforce. And it is quite evident that the biblical witness against slavery was one of major importance in the minds of abolitionists. And as with regard to slavery, the Torah did not give women all of the rights it gave men, such as inheritance, but the daughters of Zelophehad began the long process of women's equality. And Richard Elliott Friedman addresses all these points, moral evolution, slavery, and women's rights. He said this: there is little point in debating whether this step means that the Torah is supportive of women on the grounds that it provides for them to inherit, or whether it means that the Torah is unfair to women on the grounds that sons still precede daughters. The fact is that social transformations take time, generations, centuries, and even millennia. And the Torah established the revolutionary principle that women have rights. We can wish that went farther, but we would do better to examine how far it went in its age, and how much this contributed to women's equality in the millennia that followed. The larger point is that I made with regard to slavery. The Torah does not forbid it and attempt to bring an end to it overnight. It gives laws of the treatment of slaves, which involved granting respect, rights, and compassion for slaves. And this eventually undermined slavery as an institution. Yeah. And then, of course, in the New Testament, especially with the book of Philemon, you have a runaway slave who meets Paul, but then Paul sends that slave back to this guy Philemon, but he tells him to not take him back as a slave, but as a brother. Yeah, and thus, really reining in on the institution of slavery, and then eventually, gradually over time, with the godly principles being followed, eventually it would lead to the end of it. Yeah. But of course, ultimately, ultimate slavery to Christ is the good thing. Yeah, be a slave to Christ. He's the ultimate good master. That's the main thing. Don't be a slave to sin. That's actual bondage. So the diminution of slavery and the increase of women's rights are two of the major developments of the past, like the 20th century. And the Torah's laws played an early and determinative part in birthing and nurturing both of these revolutions. Verse 8. Further, speak to the Israelite people as follows: If a man dies without leaving a son, you shall transfer his property to his daughter. So even if only to preserve the name of a family man who had no sons, the ability of the Israelite woman to inherit their father's property if he had no sons was a major advance for women. A woman could henceforth inherit property, and her right to do so suspended that of any male relative. Superseded that of any male relative other than a brother. And as Jane Austen frequently pointed out, this was not the case even in the late 18th and 19th century of 19th century England. And there's a reference to that book, Pride and Prejudice. The plot of Pride and Prejudice rests on the inability of the 5 daughters to inherit their father's estate. Never read that book, but I know I've heard about it. And if he has no daughter, you shall assign his property to his brothers. And if he has no brothers, you shall assign his property to his father's brothers. And if he has no father's brothers, you shall assign the property to his nearest relative in his own clan, and he shall inherit it. And this shall be the law of procedure for the Israelites in accordance with the Lord's command to Moses. So this law, guaranteeing daughters the right of inheritance in the absence of brothers, probably had to come directly from God. Had it come from Moses, the people may have dismissed it as too radical. And one might ask, if a wife survived her husband, why would she not receive the inheritance, given that a daughter can receive it? And the answer to that is under Jewish law. The inheritance was always to go to the future generation to ensure the property remained within the tribe. And in turn, sons were required to support their widowed mother from their inheritance. Otherwise, if the widowed mother remarried a man from a different tribe and then predeceased her new husband, then he would inherit the property, which would then be lost to her sons and their tribe. And this could lead to intertribal resentment and all the problems that would entail. Yeah, just fighting and all that stuff. Family feud, I guess you could say. Yeah, not a good answer. Alright. Verse 12. The Lord said to Moses, ascend these heights of Abrim, and view the land that I have given to the Israelite people. And ever since God appeared to Moses at the burning bush and asked him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt and into Canaan, Moses yearned to enter into the promised land. But in this verse, God informed Moses again that he will see Canaan but not enter it, because of dishonoring God in Numbers 20. While one deeply sympathizes with Moses, he did get to see, literally, his life's mission realized, which is more than many people get to do. And like his brother Aaron, Moses too will not enter into the promised land. So this is verse 13. When you have seen it, you shall be gathered to your kin. Yeah, you too shall be gathered to your kin. In this term, you too, it demands a comment. Why doesn't God simply say, you will be gathered with your kin? Why does he say, you too? It would seem to be of God's way of saying to Moses that just as his brother Aaron did not escape the consequences of the episode at Meribah, neither will Moses, as great of a man as he was. The Torah frequently uses the phrase gathered to your kin to describe death. That of Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, and Jacob, Aaron, and now Moses. Since being gathered to one's kin takes place after one dies before one is buried, and it can only mean that reunion with one's kin has nothing to do with being buried among kin, and it therefore strongly implies a non-physical reunion after death, that is, an afterlife. And you'll be gathered to your kin as your brother, just as your brother Aaron was. Like Aaron, Moses was commanded to ascend a mountain to die there. However, whereas Aaron died right after he and Moses disobeyed God, Moses' death was postponed until he completed his mission of leading the Israelites through the desert. And then, of course, writing of Deuteronomy. Why God explained again, why will he not allow Moses into the promised land? 14. For in the wilderness of Zin, when the community was contentious, you disobeyed my command to uphold my sanctity in their sight by the means of the water. And these are the waters of Meribah, Kadesh, and the wilderness of Zin. So, as explained earlier, Numbers 20:10, contrary to popular belief, Moses was not punished for hitting the rock, but for failing to acknowledge God as the source of the miracle of extracting water from it. While he and his brother extracted water from the rock, in the Numbers story, not in Exodus, Moses said that he and Aaron did not mention God would extract water from the rock. And by reiterating the reason for Moses' punishment, God again explained why he forbade Moses from entering into the promised land, and God's explanation served several possible ends. First, it reinforced the radical Torah innovation that unlike the pagan gods, the God of Israel is not capricious. And therefore, God explained to Moses why he was not allowing Moses to enter into the promised land, enter into Canaan. That the God of the Torah is not capricious was established by the first Jew, Abraham, when he argued with God and asked God, will the judge of all the earth not judge justly? Yeah, whenever he was concerned about what's going to happen with the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. Like if there's any righteous people there, are you going to spare them, spare the cities for the sake of those righteous people? And second, and related to the first reason, God could have simply said, you're not getting into Israel, and I'm the creator, and that's all you need to know. But out of compassion and respect for Moses, God felt the need to offer an explanation. No pagan god would be so inclined, although God doesn't always explain everything. Yeah, not always. And therefore, in keeping with Judaism's radical monotheism, this third reason, God's decision was made in order to prevent Israel from worshiping any human being, and even Moses. And if Moses were allowed to lead the Israelites into the land of Israel, lead the Israelites into Israel, after having taken credit for the miracle of extracting water from a rock, a cult of Moses worship might have easily have developed. And it is for that reason that the Torah notes that Moses' burial place will never be known. And it is for this reason Moses' name is mentioned only once and only in passing in the Passover Seder service, to make it clear that it was not Moses who took the Jews out of Egypt, it was God. Yeah, he just used Moses, though. And Rashi offers a fourth reason. A decree had been made against the generation of the wilderness, those who left Egypt, that they should die in the wilderness on account of the sin that they did not have faith in God. Therefore Moses requested that the nature of his offense be stated in the Torah, so that people might say, he too was one of the rebels. Okay. So Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, let the Lord, source of the source of the breath of all flesh, appoint someone over the community, who shall go out before them and come in before them, and who shall take them out and bring them in, so that the Lord's community may not be like sheep that have no shepherd. So, two modern commentators note the unique importance of this brief verse. According to Pinchas Polonsky, he said this: this is the only place in the entire Torah where we find such an atypical reverse formulation instead of the usual "the Lord spoke to Moses saying," which introduces many of the commandments. And the purpose of reversing the phrasing here is to emphasize that Moses here for the first time addresses God with a demand. He demands that the Almighty show his concern for the people of Israel by appointing a leader to succeed Moses. And then Richard Elliott Friedman says this is the last time that Moses is quoted as saying anything to God. And in Deuteronomy, Moses will report to the people his past conversations with God, but these are the last words of Moses to God in the Torah. And his last concern is the people, that they should have a leader. And note that all of this draws us back to Moses' first meeting with God at the burning bush. God begins the charge to Moses, thereby expressing concern for the people. I've seen the degradation of my people. It's hard to say that. It's Exodus 3:7. So God's first charge to Moses and Moses' last request of God are both about the people, about the good of the people. And whereas God selected Aaron's successor upon Aaron's death, Moses' greatness was such that once he realized that God would not relent and permit him to enter Canaan, he immediately began to plan and ask God to plan for his own succession. And Moses was certainly right about the nation needing leadership. Should human leaders be shepherds? But as often as the term may be used biblically, shepherd is not the ideal term for a mortal leader. One reason is that the only shepherd God's people, or for that matter any people, should need is God. And as for the most famous psalm, the 23rd Psalm begins, "The Lord is my shepherd." And of course Jesus in the New Testament says, "I am the good shepherd. I lay down my life for the sheep." Another reason is that people need leaders, not shepherds, because people shouldn't be sheep. The historical record shows that too many nations have acted as sheep, and too many shepherds wanted their people to be sheep, and the results have been horrific. The ideal then is not an absence of leaders, which that would lead to anarchy, but for people not to act as sheep. Yeah, but of course we're sheep spiritually because we always go astray. We wander off into sin, and we need the good shepherd, Jesus, to come and save us and to bring us into the ultimate promised land. Yeah, the new heavens and the new earth. Yeah, the ultimate Joshua. So, yeah, and that, will, of course, will be the guy who ends up succeeding Moses, Joshua. So the Lord answered Moses, "Single out Joshua, son of Nun, an inspired man, and lay your hand upon him." So Aaron's son Eleazar succeeded Aaron, but neither of Moses' sons succeeded him. The reason is that the priesthood is inherited, while political leadership must be earned. Indeed, not only was Joshua not Moses' son, Joshua came from another tribe, Ephraim. The fact that God did not choose either of Moses' sons to succeed Moses established an essential value for making a good society. Leadership must be given to those who earn the right to lead, not to family. And Lawrence E. Harrison, a scholar who spent much of his life as a United States, spent much of his life as a United States Agency for International Development, USAID. He was a mission director in Latin America. He described one of the primary reasons North America dramatically surpassed Latin America socially, politically, and economically. Well, the reason is because Latin America was largely governed by what he called familism. Hiring and appointing people largely based on family ties. Whereas in North America, people were hired and appointed largely based on merit. No society can succeed if it uses any standard other than merit to enable people to advance. Not by blood, not by race, DEI, not sex, and not wealth. By merit. Are you good at the job? Have you earned it? But why was Joshua chosen to succeed Moses? So God told Moses to go single out Joshua and lay his hands upon him. And Joshua is an inspired man. So the Hebrew words Ish, Asher, Ruach, Bo, however you say that, they're translated here as an inspired man, and that literally means a man who has spirit in him. Spirit likely refers to both the divine and the human. And Joshua had the Spirit of God and was a man who possessed an independent and strong spirit. Regarding Joshua's divine spirit, I guess probably the Holy Spirit, Polonsky explains that Joshua received his special connection with God at the giving of the Torah, When Moses ascended the mountain for his 40-day stay at the summit, Joshua waited for Moses not down below like the rest of the people, but halfway up the mountain, implied in Exodus 32:17, and thus Joshua had no involvement whatsoever in the incident of the golden calf. Meanwhile, Joshua's independent spirit and strength was manifested in his descent of all the other spies except for Caleb. Joshua's descent is an excellent example of an important rule of life. Not all outliers do good, but virtually all good is done by outliers. People that are not like everybody else. One reason is it takes courage to be an outlier, and courage is the rarest of all the good human traits. Whatever the number of kind, responsible, nice, and even loving people are, well, there are far fewer courageous people, and really you can't have any of these traits ultimately without courage. You're not going to do what's ultimately good if you don't have courage. And while there are atheist outliers who do good, most outliers, like Joshua, have a connection to God. And of course, us Christians are supposed to be outliers. And of course, it ain't easy to be an outlier, though. Yeah, it takes courage. Alright, verse 19. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and before the whole community, and commission him in their sight. Invest him with some of your authority so that the whole Israelite community may obey. Some of your authority? No Jew will ever have all the authority that Moses had. Only Moses spoke to God face to face. But he shall present himself to Eleazar the priest, who shall on his behalf seek the decision of the Urim before the Lord. And by such instruction they shall go out, and by such instruction they shall come in, he and all the Israelites, the whole community. According to Hertz, unlike Moses, he, Joshua, was not to receive divine communication directly, but indirectly through the medium of Eleazar the high priest, after the latter's consultation with God by the means of the Urim and the Thummim. And the Urim, also known as the Urim and the Thummim, they were stones on the breastplate that was worn by the high priest that served as oracles to convey God's word in response to yes or no questions. Just another way to seek God's will, I guess, at the time. And Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua and had him stand before Eleazar the priest and before the whole community. And as God had directly chosen Moses to be Israel's leader, no human being was involved in Moses' ordination. But that will not be the case with Moses' successor. Though God chose Joshua, he would be ordained by human beings, Moses and Eleazar the head priest. This gives one an appreciation of how important the priesthood was in ancient Israel. Later in the book of Deuteronomy, Polinsky writes, Moses will mandate that the power be further divided into not just 2, but 4 independent branches: the kingdom, royalty, the priesthood, the sages, and the prophets. Moses himself united all 4 of these branches. He was all of the above: a king, a prophet, the highest of the high priests, and a sage. Of course, Jesus is the ultimate one. Alright, last verse. 23. He laid his hands upon him and commissioned him as the Lord had spoken through Moses. So God commanded Moses to lay your hand upon him. But Moses laid both his hands on Joshua's head, perhaps to make it clear that he was vesting all his authority in Joshua. This act had a profound impact on Jewish history. Jewish tradition holds that Joshua appointed his successor in the same manner, through the laying on of hands, and that leadership continued to be appointed in this manner for so many generations. And since Moses and Joshua were also religious leaders, rabbis too were ordained in this manner. And I think even Timothy in the New Testament was ordained by the laying on of hands by the apostles and other Christian leaders in the New Testament. Yeah. And then Prager's friend, Joseph Telushkin, notes that the rabbis of the ancient world must have had an extraordinary sense of empowerment, knowing that those who ordained them had themselves been ordained by prophets, judges, and rabbis of the previous generation in an unbroken line going back to Moses. And later, in the aftermath of the 2nd century Bar Kokhba rebellion by the Jews against the Roman rule, the Romans, in an effort to extinguish Judaism, made the ceremony of laying on of hands known as Shemitah, however you say that, but the Romans made that a capital offense for both the ordaining of a rabbi and a Jew being ordained. And the unbroken line of succession to Moses thereby ended. And to this day, Shemitah, or however you say that, is the term for rabbinic ordination. Okay, well that's actually the end of Numbers 27. Lord willing, I'll get to 28 another time, but until then, may God bless you and the grace and mercy won by Jesus, the love of God, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all. Amen.